Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Jack Halloran returned to his quiet lakefront home, he expected sunsets and cold beer, not a massive warehouse, razor wire, and a forged permit in a stranger's name sitting on his land. What began as an absurd HOA dispute was about to explode into fraud, corruption, and a fight for justice. My name is Jack Halloran, 42 years old, former Army Corps of Engineers construction specialist, and currently the proud owner of a lakefront property in Maine that's about to become the center of the most absurd property dispute you've ever heard. I'd been away for 3 weeks in Vermont, helping rebuild a dam after the spring floods had nearly wiped out half of Stowe. Good money, honest work, and the kind of engineering challenge that reminded me why I loved my job in the Corps. When you're dealing with concrete and steel and the raw power of water, everything else seems manageable. Little did I know I was about to face something far more destructive than any natural disaster. A homeowners association president with delusions of grandeur and a complete disregard for property law. The drive back to my place on Lakeview Road took about 4 hours, and I was looking forward to nothing more than cracking open a cold beer on my dock and watching the sunset over Mirror Lake. My property sits on about 2 acres of prime lakefront real estate that I'd bought 5 years ago with my military savings and a decent VA loan. The main house, a renovated 1950s cabin, sits about 50 yards back from the water. Down by the shore, I've got a decent dock, a boat shed for my fishing gear, and about 200 yards of empty land that I'd been saving for future projects, maybe a workshop, maybe a guest cabin, maybe just leaving it wild for the deer and the occasional turkey that wandered through. The first sign something was wrong came when I pulled into my gravel driveway and found a yellow slip stuck to my front door. Tom Brewster, our local mail carrier, had left a note saying that the lady from the HOA had been by twice trying to deliver important documents, and would I please contact their office immediately. That was odd for 2 reasons. First, I'm not a member of any HOA, made damn sure of that when I bought the place. Second, the Lakeview Shores HOA that governed the development next to mine had never shown any interest in my property before, except for Karen Bridgewater's occasional passive-aggressive comments about how I really should consider joining the community for everyone's benefit. I unlocked the door and found my mailbox stuffed with the usual collection of bills, catalogs, and what looked like official correspondence. Among the pile was a thick envelope marked Urgent Building Violation Notice with the Lakeview Shores HOA letterhead. Inside was a formal notice of violation, complete with photographs, claiming I had constructed an unauthorized recreational structure on my property without proper permits or HOA approval. The fine was listed as $2,500, with an additional $500 per week until the violation was corrected. I stared at that paper for a full minute, wondering if I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The photographs showed what looked like a wooden structure near the water, but the image quality was so poor and taken from such a distance that I couldn't make out any details. According to the notice, this sauna or bathhouse had been constructed sometime in the past month and was in direct violation of lakefront development guidelines established for the protection and aesthetic harmony of our community. The absurdity of it was almost funny. Almost. I hadn't built so much as a birdhouse in the past 6 months, let alone any kind of structure that would require permits. But there it was, in black and white, complete with case numbers and legal references that looked impressive enough to fool someone who didn't know better. I decided to call the HOA office directly, figuring this had to be some kind of clerical error. Maybe they'd mixed up properties, or someone had submitted a false report. The phone rang 4 times before clicking over to an automated message in Karen Bridgewater's crisp, authoritative voice, explaining that the office was closed and all inquiries should be submitted in writing for review at the next board meeting, scheduled for the following month. That's when I decided to take a walk around my own property and see what the hell they were talking about. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the pine trees as I headed down toward the water, following the worn path I'd used countless times over the past 5 years. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. The dock needed a few loose boards tightened, the boat shed could use a fresh coat of stain, and the empty lot stretched away through the trees toward the property line I shared with the HOA development. But as I got closer to that back section, I started noticing things that definitely hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Heavy tire tracks cut deep ruts through the soft soil near the tree line. The kind of tracks left by construction equipment, maybe a small excavator or a delivery truck carrying building materials. The tracks led from the main road, across what should have been undisturbed forest floor, straight toward the farthest corner of my lot. I followed those tracks, and that's when I saw it. Fresh survey stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals, each one marked with bright orange tape. Someone had been doing a lot more than just building a sauna. Someone had been conducting a full-scale land survey of my property, and they'd done it while I was 800 miles away, earning an honest living. The sun was starting to set behind the mountains across the lake when I ran into Tom and Betty Morrison, my neighbors from the next property over. They were coming back from their evening fishing trip carrying a decent string of bass and looking like they had something important to tell me. "Jack," Tom called out as soon as he spotted me. "Boy, are we glad to see you back. We were starting to wonder if you knew about all the construction noise coming from your back lot." Betty nodded vigorously, still holding her fishing rod. "Went on for weeks, honey. Big trucks coming and going, men with hard hats, the whole 9 yards. We figured you'd hired someone to build that workshop you were always talking about." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. "What construction? I haven't authorized any construction." Tom and Betty exchanged glances, the kind of look that passes between people who suddenly realize they might be delivering very bad news. "Well," Tom said slowly, "whoever those boys were, they seemed to know what they were doing. Had all kinds of official-looking paperwork, permits posted on the trees, the works. Said they were working for the property owner, and everything was cleared through the county building department." That night, I sat on my front porch with a beer I couldn't taste and tried to make sense of what I'd learned. Someone had conducted major construction on my property without my knowledge or permission. The HOA was claiming I'd built something without proper authorization. And somewhere in the gap between those two facts was a story that I had a feeling was going to get a lot worse before it got better. The next morning, I grabbed my camera, measuring tape, and a thermos of coffee and headed straight for the back corner of my property where those construction tracks disappeared into the trees. What I found there made me question whether I was still asleep and having some kind of fever dream. Standing on my land, bold as brass and twice as shiny, was a massive metal warehouse that looked like it could house a small aircraft. The structure had to be at least 40 feet wide by 60 feet long, with a peaked roof that rose a good 20 feet into the air, professional-grade siding, proper gutters, even a concrete pad foundation that someone had poured without my knowledge. This wasn't some weekend warriors shed project. This was a serious commercial building that probably cost more than most people's cars. The whole thing was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, complete with no trespassing signs and what looked like a professional security system. Motion sensors mounted on posts, camera housings pointed in every direction, and an electrical box that was definitely connected to something more sophisticated than a basic alarm. Through a gap in the fence, I could see that the main entrance had not one but 3 different locks, including what looked like an electronic keypad system. But the real kicker was the sign mounted prominently on the front of the building. Lakeview Storage, authorized, personnel only, property of Lakeview Shores HOA. In smaller print below, there was a phone number for rental inquiries and a warning that unauthorized access will result in prosecution to the full extent of the law. I managed to find a spot where I could peer through a crack in the metal siding, and what I saw inside made my blood pressure spike. Row after row of metal shelving units, loaded with everything from boat motors to riding lawnmowers to what looked like construction equipment. This wasn't just a storage building. It was a full-scale commercial operation, complete with inventory tags and rental spaces marked out with yellow paint on the concrete floor. I spent the next hour taking photographs from every possible angle, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates on my phone for each shot. The building was definitely on my property. I'd walked the boundary lines enough times to know exactly where my land ended and the HOA development began. This warehouse was sitting a good 50 feet inside my property line, right in the middle of what I'd always considered prime real estate for future development. The really infuriating part was how professional the whole operation looked. Someone had invested serious money in this project, tens of thousands of dollars at minimum. The electrical service alone must have cost a fortune, especially since I could see where they'd run underground cables from the main road. They'd even installed proper drainage around the foundation and what looked like a gravel access road wide enough for delivery trucks. When I called the county building department from my truck, the clerk cheerfully informed me that yes, they had issued a building permit for a private storage facility on my property 3 months ago. The permit had been requested by one John Halverson, and all the paperwork had been properly filed and approved. When I explained that I was Jack Halloran, the actual property owner, and that I'd never heard of any John Halverson, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sir," the clerk said slowly, "are you saying someone forged your signature on official county documents?" That's exactly what I was saying, though at the time I was still trying to wrap my head around the sheer audacity of what had happened. Someone hadn't just trespassed on my property. They'd created an entirely fictional person, forged building permits, and constructed a commercial facility while I was out of state working an honest job. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the pine trees when I finally headed back to the house, my camera full of evidence and my mind racing with questions. Who the hell was John Halverson? How had they gotten away with this for 3 months? And most importantly, what was I going to do about a 40 by 60 foot warehouse that had sprouted on my land like some kind of capitalist mushroom? The next morning, I decided it was time to have a direct conversation with Karen Bridgewater. I'd dealt with enough bureaucrats and petty tyrants during my Army days to know that the best approach was usually straight to the source. I called the HOA office at 8 sharp and got the same automated message, so I tried Karen's personal number, which I'd gotten from Tom Morrison a few months back when she'd been hassling him about his boat trailer. Karen answered on the second ring with the kind of crisp, professional tone that immediately put me on guard. When I explained who I was and demanded an immediate meeting at the warehouse on my property, her response was everything I'd expected and worse. "Mr. Halloran," she said, drawing out my name like it tasted bad. "I'm quite busy today, but I suppose I can spare a few minutes to discuss your compliance issues. I'll meet you at the storage facility at 2 o'clock, and I suggest you bring your checkbook. I arrived at the warehouse 15 minutes early and spent the time taking more photographs and double-checking the property boundaries with my surveying equipment." At exactly 2 o'clock, a white Cadillac SUV pulled up to the fence, and out stepped Karen Bridgewater along with 2 other people I recognized from neighborhood gatherings: Richard Temple, a retired banker who served as HOA treasurer, and Susan Norris, who ran some kind of consulting business and always seemed to have an opinion about everything. Karen was exactly what Central Casting would order for an HOA president. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes that screamed, "I have authority," and the kind of confident stride that suggested she'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by talking to the right manager. Richard and Susan flanked her like backup singers, both carrying clipboards and wearing matching expressions of bureaucratic smugness. Before anyone could say hello, I pulled out my phone and hit the voice recorder app. "Just so we're all clear," I announced, "I'm recording this conversation for my records. Everyone okay with that?" Karen's smile tightened around the edges, but she nodded curtly. "Of course. Transparency is always best in these situations." "Good," I said. "Now, would you mind explaining to me how a 40,000 square foot commercial warehouse ended up on my private property without my knowledge or consent?" What followed was 15 minutes of the most impressive bureaucratic double talk I'd ever witnessed outside of a congressional hearing. According to Karen, my property was located in what she called a transitional community development zone that fell under HOA oversight for aesthetic and environmental protection purposes. The storage facility, she explained, was a community amenity that served the greater good of the lakefront residential area and had been constructed following extensive consultation with relevant stakeholders. When I pointed out that I was the actual owner of the land and had never been consulted about anything, Karen's tone shifted from bureaucratic to condescending. "Mr. Halloran, just because you hold title to a piece of property doesn't mean you can ignore the legitimate interests of the surrounding community. This facility serves dozens of families and contributes to property values for everyone in the area." Richard Temple tried to play peacemaker, suggesting that perhaps there had been a communication breakdown and that surely we could work something out. But then he made the mistake of letting slip that Karen told us you'd agreed to the project in exchange for reduced HOA fees if you ever decided to join. That's when Susan Norris jumped in with what she probably thought was a helpful clarification. The community voted unanimously to approve the storage facility at the March meeting. We assumed you'd received the notification letters. I let them dig themselves deeper for another few minutes, asking pointed questions about permits, environmental impact studies, and who exactly had authorized the use of my land. Karen's answers became increasingly vague and defensive until finally she pulled out her trump card. Mr. Halloran, I don't think you understand the situation here. This facility is already built. It's serving our community members, and dismantling it would be prohibitively expensive. The reasonable solution is for you to accept fair compensation for the land use and join our association. Fighting this will only cost you money you can't afford to spend. The meeting ended with Karen handing me a manila folder containing what she called a fair settlement offer, $5,000 for a perpetual easement that would allow the HOA to maintain the storage facility indefinitely. When I declined to sign anything on the spot, she informed me that I had 30 days to come to my senses before the matter would be turned over to their attorney. As the Cadillac drove away, I realized I'd gotten exactly what I came for. A recorded confession from Karen Bridgewater that she'd built a commercial facility on my land without permission and expected me to just accept it as a fait accompli. The morning after my confrontation with Karen, I called Gloria Campbell, a land dispute attorney I'd found through a quick Google search and some very promising reviews from people who'd tangled with overreaching HOAs. Gloria had 20 years of experience dealing with property rights cases and a reputation for not backing down from bullies with clipboards. Mr. Halloran, she said after I'd played her the recording of yesterday's meeting, you've got yourself a textbook case of criminal trespass, fraud, and probably conspiracy. The question is how deep this rabbit hole goes. While Gloria started filing formal document requests with the county, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I hired Mike Stone, a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases. If Karen was running some kind of scam operation, Mike would find the money trail. The breakthrough came when I contacted David Morrison, the construction contractor whose name appeared on the county building permits. David was a straight shooter who'd been building in the area for 15 years, and when I explained the situation, he went pale. Jesus, Jack, she told me you were out of town but had approved everything through your property manager, he said, pulling out a thick folder of documents. She had permits, surveys, even a signed contract with someone named John Halverson. I figured he was your brother or business partner or something. David showed me copies of all the paperwork Karen had provided. The permits looked official, the surveys appeared legitimate, and the signature on the contracts was a decent forgery of what my name might look like if I wrote it differently. Someone had put serious effort into creating a paper trail that would fool a busy contractor. David continued. The whole job cost $85,000, paid in full with checks from the HOA account. Karen said it was coming out of some kind of community development fund. That evening, Mike Stone called with his preliminary findings. Karen's financial activities were more extensive than I'd imagined. She'd registered a limited liability company called Lakeshore Storage Solutions just 1 week before construction began, listing herself as the sole owner. The company had already collected over $12,000 in rental fees from local residents who thought they were paying the HOA for legitimate storage space. But the real smoking gun came when Mike accessed the HOA's financial records through a public information request. The $85,000 for construction hadn't come from any community development fund. It had been transferred directly from the HOA's operating account, the money that residents paid in monthly dues for lawn maintenance and snow plowing. Gloria filed an emergency injunction the next morning, demanding that all activity at the warehouse cease immediately pending a full investigation. She also requested that the county freeze all permits associated with the fictitious John Halverson and launch their own inquiry into how forged documents had made it through their approval process. By afternoon, I had security cameras installed along my property line and a court order giving me the right to restrict access to the warehouse. Karen's little empire was about to come crashing down, and I had a feeling she was going to take a lot of people with her. Karen found out about the injunction before I did. My phone started ringing at 6:30 the next morning with a call from an unlisted number. When I answered, a man's voice I didn't recognize told me I was making a big mistake and should mind my own business before someone minded it for me. The call lasted exactly 30 seconds before the line went dead. By noon, every resident in the Lakeview Shores development had received a letter from Karen describing me as a disruptive individual who was attempting to destroy community property and threatening the safety and property values of law-abiding families. The letter painted me as some kind of unhinged hermit who was jealous of their successful community and wanted to drag everyone down with frivolous lawsuits. Tom Morrison brought me a copy of the letter along with a petition that Karen was circulating. The petition demanded that I cease my harassment of the Lakeview Shores community and accept reasonable compensation for the greater good. According to Tom, Karen had already collected 47 signatures from residents who had no idea what they were actually signing. "She's telling people you're trying to shut down their storage facility out of spite," Tom explained. "Half these folks have boats and lawn equipment stored in there. They're scared they'll lose their stuff." That night, the intimidation tactics escalated. Someone called my house every hour from 2 a.m. until dawn, letting the phone ring twice before hanging up. When I tried calling the numbers back, they all went to disconnected voicemails. Mike Stone's security cameras caught a figure prowling around the warehouse at 3 in the morning, checking locks and appearing to meet with 2 other people whose faces weren't visible in the darkness. The next day brought a new development that made everything crystal clear. While reviewing the footage from my security cameras, I noticed vehicles coming and going from the warehouse during business hours. Mike Stone ran the license plates and discovered that several local contractors and business owners were actively renting space in the facility, paying $200 per month directly to Karen's personal account. A handwritten sign had appeared overnight on the warehouse door: "Storage space available. Contact K." Bridgewater for rates and availability. Karen wasn't just stealing my land, she was running a profitable side business using property that didn't belong to her, all while convincing her neighbors that I was the villain for trying to stop her. The breaking point came when I discovered that the warehouse was connected to my electrical service without my knowledge or consent. The power company confirmed that someone had filed paperwork 3 months ago, authorizing a secondary agricultural use connection for my property, complete with a forged signature and fake utility deposit. When Sheriff's Deputy Connor Riley arrived to investigate the illegal electrical connection, he found evidence that Karen's operation was more sophisticated than anyone had realized. The warehouse had its own electrical meter, security system, and even climate control, all running on electricity that I was paying for without knowing it. "Ma'am," Deputy Riley told Karen when she arrived to supervise his inspection, "you're looking at theft of services, fraud, and probably a few other charges I haven't thought of yet." Mike Stone's investigation exploded into something much bigger than a simple property dispute. His full report, delivered to Gloria's office on a Thursday morning, revealed that Karen had been running a systematic fraud operation through the HOA for at least 2 years. The financial records showed a pattern of special assessments and community improvement fees that had been charged to residents for projects that either didn't exist or cost far less than reported. Karen had collected over $60,000 for a lake access improvement project that turned out to be basic dock maintenance she'd done herself. Another $40,000 had been raised for emergency road repairs that consisted of filling a few potholes with gravel. But the warehouse scheme was her masterpiece. Not only had she built it with HOA funds on stolen land, but she'd been collecting rental income from both HOA members who thought they were paying community storage fees and outside businesses who believed they were dealing with a legitimate storage company. Mike estimated her total illegal profits at over $150,000. The smoking gun came when Gloria's document requests uncovered Karen's relationship with Derek Fisher, a mid-level clerk in the county building department. Derek had been fast-tracking permit applications for Karen's various projects in exchange for monthly payments disguised as consulting fees for his wife's non-existent landscaping business. Armed with this evidence, I called an emergency meeting of all HOA residents at the community center. The turnout was massive. Nearly every household sent at least one representative, and several people brought lawyers of their own after word spread about the scope of Karen's activities. Richard Temple and Susan Norris sat in the front row, looking like they'd been hit by a truck. When I presented the financial records showing how their dues had been systematically stolen, Richard actually stood up and demanded that Karen explain herself immediately. "This is all speculation and character assassination," Karen declared from the back of the room. Mr. Halloran is a disgruntled non-member who's trying to destroy our community out of jealousy and spite. These so-called investigators are working for him, and their reports are biased lies. But her defense crumbled when David Morrison took the microphone and described exactly how she'd manipulated him into building the warehouse with forged documents. Then Mike Stone presented bank records showing money flowing from HOA accounts to Karen's personal businesses, complete with dates, amounts, and photocopied checks with her signature. The meeting ended with the HOA board voting unanimously to remove Karen as president and turn all financial records over to the district attorney. By the time people started filing out, Karen was sitting alone, her face pale and her hands shaking as she stared at the evidence scattered across the table in front of her. District Attorney Jennifer Hawkins announced the next morning that her office would be opening a criminal investigation into the HOA fraud case, with Karen Bridgewater as the primary suspect. The story hit the local newspaper before I even finished my morning coffee. HOA president accused of massive fraud scheme was the headline across the front page of the Lakeshore Tribune, complete with a photograph of the warehouse and a sidebar explaining how homeowner associations had become breeding grounds for petty corruption across the state. By noon, I had 3 different television news crews setting up equipment on my property. The story had everything reporters loved: a corrupt official, stolen money, forged documents, and a working-class veteran fighting back against bureaucratic bullying. Channel 8's Evening News led with my story, and suddenly my phone was ringing with calls from newspapers as far away as Portland and Boston. Karen hired Robert Kingsley, one of those expensive defense attorneys who specialize in making white-collar criminals look like misunderstood public servants. Kingsley's strategy was predictable: blame everyone except his client. According to him, Karen was the victim of unscrupulous contractors who had taken advantage of her trusting nature and manipulated official documents without her knowledge. The strategy might have worked if Karen had kept her mouth shut, but she couldn't resist trying to control the narrative. She gave an interview to the Tribune claiming that I was part of some kind of conspiracy to destroy honest Americans who were just trying to build stronger communities. She actually suggested that I had somehow orchestrated the entire scheme to make her look bad, which would have required me to forge my own signature and steal my own land. Judge Margaret O'Brien wasn't impressed with Karen's media campaign. At the preliminary hearing, she issued a restraining order prohibiting anyone from using the warehouse pending resolution of the criminal and civil cases. She also doubled Karen's bail after prosecutors presented evidence that she'd been trying to liquidate assets and transfer money to offshore accounts. The courtroom was packed for the main hearing. David Morrison testified about the forged permits and fake contracts. Mike Stone walked the jury through Karen's financial schemes with charts and graphs that made the money trail impossible to ignore. A handwriting expert confirmed that the John Halverson signature was a clumsy forgery that wouldn't fool a bank teller, let alone a building inspector. But the most damaging testimony came from Derek Fisher, who'd been arrested the same week as Karen and decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Derek described in detail how Karen had approached him with a business proposition that involved expediting permits for cash payments and looking the other way when documents didn't quite match up. She told me she was doing important work for the community, Derek said from the witness stand. She made it sound like we were partners in some kind of public service project. I didn't realize until later that she was stealing people's money and land. Karen's composure finally cracked during cross-examination. When Gloria pressed her about the warehouse rental income, Karen started shouting about ungrateful neighbors and outside agitators who didn't understand what she'd sacrificed for the community. Judge O'Brien had to threaten her with contempt charges to get her to sit down and be quiet. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge O'Brien sentenced Karen to 8 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to both the HOA and me personally. The look on her face when the bailiff led her away in handcuffs was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Pure disbelief that her little empire of lies had finally collapsed. Derek Fisher got 3 years for his role in the permit fraud and was permanently barred from any government employment. The county building department implemented new verification procedures that required in-person appearances for all major permit applications, specifically because of what they started calling the Bridgewater case. The HOA voted to pay me $200. and $50,000 in damages, plus the full cost of demolishing the warehouse and restoring my property. It took them 3 months to dismantle the building and haul away all the equipment, but I have to admit, I enjoyed watching every minute of it. Some of the storage unit renters were angry about losing their space, but most people understood that they'd been paying to use stolen property. I used part of the settlement money to build a beautiful cedar gazebo right where Karen's warehouse had stood. It's got comfortable chairs, a view of the lake, and a small plaque that reads, "Private property of the Halloran family. Friends welcome. HOA. Employees." Not so much. Tom and Betty Morrison have become regular visitors to my new gazebo. We spend most summer evenings out there, fishing and sharing stories about the neighborhood. Tom likes to joke that I'm the only person he knows who got rich by having someone else steal his land, which isn't exactly how I'd describe the experience, but I appreciate the sentiment. The new HOA board officially apologized to me at their first meeting after Karen's conviction and invited me to join their annual community picnic. I declined membership. I still don't trust HOAs in general, but I did show up to the picnic with a cooler full of beer and some of the best fish stories anyone's heard in years. My phone still rings occasionally with calls from people in other states who've heard about my case and want advice about their own HOA problems. I always tell them the same thing: document everything, hire a good lawyer, and never underestimate the power of someone who thinks they're above the law to eventually hang themselves with their own rope. The local newspaper runs a follow-up story every year on the anniversary of Karen's conviction, usually with a headline like, "Remember when the HOA president tried to steal a guy's land?" It's become something of a local legend, the kind of story that gets told around campfires and at town meetings whenever someone starts complaining about government overreach. Last month, I got a letter from a law school professor asking if she could use my case as a teaching example in her property law course. Apparently, Karen's scheme has become a textbook example of how not to run a homeowner association and why proper oversight matters in community organizations. As I write this, I'm sitting in my gazebo watching the sunset over Mirror Lake, exactly where I wanted to be when I first came home from that job in Vermont. Karen Bridgewater is probably staring at the walls of a federal prison cell, wondering how her perfectly planned community improvement project turned into an 8-year sentence. Sometimes justice actually works the way it's supposed to.